Most people learn about the Barbary Pirates as a footnote, a minor irritant in the Mediterranean that a young America eventually got around to dealing with. A few frigates, a famous battle, a line in the Marine hymn. That's usually where it ends. But the real scale of what happened is almost never taught. Between 1530 and 1780, over 1 million Europeans were taken into slavery by the Barbary states of North Africa. Not in ones and twos from captured ships. Whole villages, gone in a single night. The Cornish coast, the Devon fishing communities, the merchant routes out of Bristol, England bled for over a century, and most people today couldn't tell you why. In 1631, a fleet led by a Dutch-born Barbary captain named Murad Rice landed on the coast of Ireland at a village called Baltimore. By morning, 107 people had been taken. Men, women, children, almost none of them ever came back. That's where this story starts. Not in Philadelphia, not with the Constitution. It starts on the coastline of the British Isles, with empty houses and families who spent the rest of their lives waiting for someone who was never coming home. And it ends with the United States becoming a fundamentally different country than its founders originally planned. The number that stops people is the million. It sounds inflated, like the kind of round figure that gets attached to historical atrocities without much rigor behind it. But historians working from primary sources, harbor records, ransom ledgers, diplomatic correspondence, put the figure at over 1 million Europeans enslaved between 1530 and 1780. That's not a guess. That's arithmetic from the archives. And the raids weren't piracy in the romantic sense. There was nothing opportunistic about it. The Barbary states, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, Morocco, ran on enslaved European labor. It was state-sponsored extraction, as organized as any industry of the period. Raiding fleets went out on schedules. The slave markets in Algiers operated openly, with buyers and prices and categories for different types of captive. It was an economy, and European coastlines were the supply chain. England sat squarely in that supply chain. In 1625, Barbary raiders hit Mounts Bay in Cornwall and took 60 people. Over the following decade, the raids on the English coast became frequent enough that Parliament started receiving petitions from fishing communities along the southwest coast, begging for naval protection. Some of those petitions survive. The language in them is plain and frightened. Fishermen describing neighbors taken in the night. Women asking the crown to do something, anything, to stop what was happening to their villages. Some communities simply stopped living near the water. What happened to the people who were taken is documented in the accounts of those who eventually came back, and in the writings of people like the clergyman and historian Joseph Morgan, who recorded what he saw in the slave markets of North Africa in the early 1700s. European captives were paraded through the markets, assessed, and sold. The deliberate humiliation was part of the system. It was meant to signal the total inversion of the Christian social order. And the theological justification for it was stated openly by the slavers themselves. This wasn't hidden, it was announced. For wealthy English families, the only real option was ransom. Churches held collections, relatives liquidated property, the crown occasionally negotiated, usually at enormous cost. But the economics never worked in the captives' favor. Most of them simply disappeared into North Africa and were never heard from again. This was still the living reality of Atlantic Europe when Thomas Jefferson and John Adams sat down in London in 1786. Not ancient history, not a fading memory, a machine that had been running continuously for 250 years and that had just begun turning its attention toward American ships. In March 1786, Jefferson and Adams met with Sidi Haji Abdrahman, the ambassador of Tripoli, to the court of St. James. Jefferson was the American minister to France. Adams was the minister to Britain. Between them, they represented a republic that was 3 years old and had no navy. They asked the ambassador a direct question. By what right did Tripoli make war on nations that had done them no injury? The answer went into their official report to Secretary of Foreign Affairs John Jay, and it's worth reading slowly. The ambassador told them It was written in the Quran that all nations which had not acknowledged the Prophet were sinners, whom it was the right and duty of the faithful to plunder and enslave. He cited specifically what scholars identify as Surah 929, the verse commanding believers to fight those who don't submit until they pay tribute in a state of subjection. Every sailor killed in that cause, he said, was guaranteed paradise. The man who boarded an enemy vessel first received an extra slave above his share. Jefferson and Adams sent the report to Jay and then wrote to each other about what to do next. The letters from July 1786 show two men who agreed on the facts and disagreed completely on the conclusion. Adams thought paying was cheaper than fighting. The country was exhausted from the Revolution, broke, and had nothing to send to the Mediterranean. Better to pay, build strength quietly, and deal with it later. His letter to Jefferson on July 3rd framed it plainly. The policy of Christendom had made cowards of their sailors before the standard of Muhammad, and America couldn't afford to be different yet. Jefferson disagreed. His July 11th letter to Adams laid out 5 reasons why tribute was the wrong answer. Not just practically, but permanently. Justice favored war. Honor favored it. Long-term cost favored it. And critically, he argued, paying tribute armed nothing. It bought time for Tripoli, not for America. The financial pressure eventually became impossible to ignore. By the mid-1790s, the United States was paying close to 20% of its entire federal budget in tribute to the Barbary states. $1 million a year out of roughly $5 million in total revenue, going to Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli to keep American merchant ships from being seized and their crews enslaved. Jefferson had predicted this in 1786. Adams had called it unavoidable. They were both right, and the country was paying for it. What pushed Congress to finally act wasn't a speech or a letter. It was a ship. In 1800, Captain William Bainbridge sailed the USS George Washington into Algiers to deliver tribute. And the Dey of Algiers told him he would now sail under the Algerian flag to Constantinople to deliver the Dey's own tribute to the Ottoman Sultan. Bainbridge complied, an American naval vessel, flying the flag of a North African slaving state, running errands for a foreign ruler. When Bainbridge got home, he wrote that he hoped he would never again be sent to Algiers, except with a squadron of ships behind him. But the real structural consequence had already been set in motion 6 years earlier. The Naval Act of 1794 wasn't a general defense measure. It was a direct response to Algerian seizures of American merchant ships, and the congressional debate over it was explicit about the reason. 6 frigates, funded by a government that had spent a decade arguing it couldn't afford a navy. The Constitution's Common Defense Clause wasn't drafted as an abstraction. Jefferson's letters to James Monroe from 1784 and 1785 connect the argument directly. Without a federal government that could levy taxes and build warships, every treaty the United States signed was a courtesy the other party could ignore. The Barbary situation was his proof of concept. When Jefferson became president in 1801, the Pasha of Tripoli demanded a new payment of $225,000. Jefferson refused and sent the Navy instead. The First Barbary War ran from 1801 to 1805. It didn't resolve everything. The Second Barbary War in 1815 was necessary to finish what the first one started. But the decision Jefferson made in 1801 confirmed something that his 1786 letters had only argued in theory. A country that can't enforce its own treaties doesn't really have them. The longer consequence took longer to see clearly. The Barbary Wars pushed the United States to think of itself as a power, with interests that extended past its own coastline. That wasn't the original plan. Jefferson's Democratic Republicans had argued for westward expansion and limited Atlantic entanglements. The Barbary situation overruled that instinct. Once you build a navy to survive, you tend to keep it. The foreign policy posture America adopted over the following 2 centuries, the idea that it has legitimate interests on every ocean, didn't come from ambition. It came from necessity. And the necessity was documented in letters between 2 founders sitting in London in 1786, trying to figure out what to do about a threat that had been emptying European coastlines for 2.5 centuries. The Barbary slave trade didn't stay in the Mediterranean. It reached the fishing villages of Cornwall, the coast of Ireland, the decks of American merchant ships, and eventually the floor of the Constitutional Convention. The founders didn't build the Navy because they wanted global reach. They built it because they'd spent 15 years watching what happened to countries that couldn't defend their own people at sea. Jefferson's letters make the reasoning plain. The common defense wasn't a philosophical principle someone carved into marble. It was a direct answer to a specific documented threat that had been operating continuously for over 2 centuries before the Constitution was written. The primary sources exist. The letters are archived. The parliamentary petitions survived. This history isn't obscure because the evidence is thin. It's obscure because it requires sitting with conclusions that don't fit neatly into the version of the founding most people were taught.